The JFK 35 podcast is produced by the JFK Library Foundation and made possible with the help of a generous grant from the Blanche and Irving Laurie Foundation.
With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
More than 56 years ago, President Lyndon B. Johnson stepped out of the 1968 presidential campaign to, in his words, focus solely on finding a peaceful end to the war in Vietnam.
It was a moment that seems to connect to today in 2024, when President Joe Biden stepped out of the presidential campaign and endorsed his Vice President Kamala Harris to run instead. This episode will take a look back at that pivotal moment in 1968 and also look at the history of one of the most important aspects of American democracy, the peaceful transition of power between presidents. All that and more coming up next on our special election 2024 edition of JFK 35.
And so, my fellow Americans, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country.
Hello, I'm Jamie Richardson.
And I'm Matt Porter. Welcome to the latest season of JFK 35. This season is a special one for us, where we will look at the historic nature of the 2024 election.
And we'll also look back at how today's campaigns connect to those from the 1960s. We hope you enjoy this special season as we speak with historians, journalists, and other experts to discuss presidential politics from the Kennedy era to today.
This summer, speaking from the Oval Office, President Joe Biden made a decision that few presidents have ever made: the choice not to run for another term.
My fellow Americans, I'm speaking to you tonight from behind the resolute desk in the Oval Office. In this sacred space, I'm surrounded by portraits of extraordinary American presidents. Thomas Jefferson wrote the immortal words that guide this nation. George Washington, who showed us presidents are not kings. Abraham Lincoln, who implored us to reject malice. Franklin Roosevelt, who inspired us to reject fear. I revere this office, but I love my country more. It's been the honor of my life to serve as your president. But in the defense of democracy, which is at stake, I think it's more important than any title. So I've decided the best way forward is to pass the torch to a new generation. That's the best way to unite our nation. You know, there is a time and a place for long years of experience in public life. But there's also a time and a place for new voices, fresh voices, yes, younger voices. And that time and place is now.
In the speech, Joe Biden said he would spend the rest of his term focusing on his duties as president, including navigating difficult foreign policy decisions in Ukraine and Israel, while also looking to address the difficult economic and immigration issues at home. When President Biden made his decision to step down, many couldn't help but look back to the last time a president addressed the nation from the Oval Office and told its citizens that he would not be running for re-election. That happened on March 31st, 1968, when President Lyndon B. Johnson told the nation of his intentions not to run again. Similar to today, President Johnson was facing a nation being torn apart by extreme partisan politics.
For 37 years in the service of our nation, first as a congressman, as a senator, and as vice president, and now as your president, I have put the unity of the people first. I have put it ahead of any divisive partisanship. And in these times, as in times before, it is true that a house divided against itself by the spirit of faction, of party, of region, of religion, of race, is a house that cannot stand. There is division in the American house now. There is divisiveness among us all tonight. And holding the trust that is mine as President of all the people, I cannot disregard the peril to the progress of the American people and the hope and the prospects of peace for all peoples.
In the end, he told the nation he was making the decision in the interest of country over personal politics.
With America's sons in the field far away, with America's future under challenge right here at home, with our hopes and the world's hopes for peace and the balance every day, I do not believe that I should devote an hour or a day of my time to any personal partisan causes or to any duties other than the awesome duties of this office, the presidency of your country. Accordingly, I shall not seek and I will not accept the nomination of my party for another term as your president.
There were key differences between the situations facing Presidents Biden and Johnson. Johnson was mired in a brutal war in Vietnam that was costing thousands of American lives each year. In 1968, the deadliest year of the war, more than 16,000 American troops would lose their lives. Johnson's announcement also came much earlier than President Biden, who stepped down after campaigning in all of the U.S. primaries. Joining us now to talk about Johnson and Biden's decisions is historian and author Mark Updegrove, who also serves as the president and CEO of the LBJ Foundation in Austin, Texas. Mark, thank you for joining us.
Delighted to be with you.
Welcome to the podcast.
So, Mark, this election has a lot of shades of 1968 in it. And the one that we have you here to talk about is President Biden's decision to step down out of the race this year and hand the baton over to his vice president, Kamala Harris. But before we get to today, we want to go back to that election of 1964 when LBJ was first elected. Can you talk to us about what the consensus was like if he would pursue another term, and how you would compare 1964 to how Democrats viewed Joe Biden's election in 2020 and whether or not he should have pursued a second term in 2024?
The only one who was uncertain about a run in 1964 for Lyndon Johnson was Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson expressed reservations to his wife, Lady Bird, about running again, and she quickly kept them at bay. The sort of the demons that were roaming around her husband's consciousness as it related to a run in 1964. And I think he was prepared to do so, but Lyndon Johnson, being Lyndon Johnson, had sort of these emotional tremors that came out during that time. And Lady Bird Johnson ameliorated them through a memo in which she said, you owe it to yourself to earn the presidency in your own right. And you should think if you achieve in that term, in your elected term in office, what you want to achieve, then perhaps we can look at the possibility of you stepping aside in 1968. And in fact, that's exactly what happened.
And so it was pretty early on in 1964 that Lyndon B. Johnson seriously decided he would continue to run for that 1960 seat. When did the doubts start coming in for Lyndon Johnson of whether or not he should run in 1968?
We have to remember a couple of things about the decision in 1968. And the one thing is that he had achieved some enormous things early on in his elected term in office. He knew that political capital was ephemeral, and he did everything he could to push the laws of the Great Society through in 1965 when he was standing tall in the presidency. In fact, he said, when a president is first elected, he's a giraffe. 6 months later, he is a worm. So as long as he was, again, standing tall, he wanted to get through as much as possible and did some incredible things in 1965. So that was really the high mark, the high tide of the Great Society. And so he had achieved a lot of his legislative goals early on. it was Vietnam that really dominated the latter part of his term in office, and it became a quagmire. Lyndon Johnson, of course, infamously escalated the war, and by 1968, it was very clear that the tide had turned in terms of public sentiment around the war. After the Tet Offensive, notably in March of 1968. But to answer your question, I think Lyndon Johnson was thinking far earlier than that he might step aside. He started having conversations with Lady Bird Johnson, whom I mentioned earlier, and a very close circle of advisors as early as the summer of 1967 about whether it would be prudent for him to seek another term in office. And of course, he ultimately made the decision to do so at the end of March in 1968, as these situations, including the Tet Offensive, started to build, showing the increased divisions in the country around this ultimately failed war in Vietnam.
And obviously Vietnam playing a large role. LBJ obviously had questions. There were questions about his health, and also, I don't know, I know today there's lots of polling done. Feels like there's polls put out every single day. But was LBJ maybe seeing polls in that spring that was showing that him continuing to run may make it harder for him to win again in 1968?
There were several factors in him stepping aside, and you mentioned one, and I think this is something that gets ignored frequently, and that is the fact that Lyndon Johnson had a weak heart. He had a history in his family of heart failure. His father and grandfather both died of heart attacks in their early 60s at the age of 62. And Lyndon Johnson himself had a nearly fatal heart attack in 1955 at the age of 47 that sidelined him for 6 months when he was Senate Minority Leader. So LBJ was keenly aware of his own mortality. He used to say, the Johnson boys die young, and had this premonition that he himself would die at the age of 64, which ultimately happened. What he didn't want to do is put the country through a health crisis like he had learned about from Woodrow Wilson, who had had a stroke in 1919 and was really largely out of public view for a year and a half. He had seen what happened to the country when Franklin Roosevelt had died unexpectedly in Warm Springs, Georgia in 1945, shortly into his fourth term, and how unprepared Harry Truman was to fill the presidency, what a crisis the country went through when FDR had died. He didn't want to do that. So I think that, in my view, that was the principal concern. The war in Vietnam was, of course, another major thing, the divisions that I had spoken about that played out as a result of the war in Vietnam. Politically, you're right. Politically, LBJ had seen the results of the New Hampshire primary, where Eugene McCarthy, an anti-war candidate who was also vying for the Democratic presidential nomination, had yielded 40% of the vote in New Hampshire. Notably, however, Lyndon Johnson was not on the ballot, was a write-in candidate, and got 46%. But the very notion that a candidate, an anti-war candidate, could get 40% of the vote in a state like New Hampshire was a premonition that Lyndon Johnson was vulnerable. So I don't know that was a consideration. He believed, and I believe, that he would have won the nomination had he pursued it in 1968. But he also knew, as did Lady Bird Johnson, that vying for the nomination and for the presidency would further tear the country asunder at a time when we were walking on very tenuous ground, given all that had happened during the course of 1968. It was truly, foundation shattering for the United States of America, given the crises and volatility that we experienced through that year.
And you mentioned his wife, the First Lady, Lady Bird Johnson, as somebody who he talked to and discussed this problem he was thinking about. Was there anybody else, or who were the other folks that he talked to when he was thinking about running or not again in 68?
There were a few close advisors, Jamie. One was John Connally, who was the governor of Texas and had been an aide to Lyndon Johnson, a very, very close friend. He had a few aides around him with whom he was consulting. George Christian, who was his press secretary, was one of them. Harry McPherson, another aide who was almost the conscience of Lyndon Johnson in the White House, was another. There was a very, very close and trusted circle that Lyndon Johnson turned to at that time. And as I mentioned, he first started talking about the notion of not running in the summer of 1967 when he convened this trusted group at the LBJ Ranch. And again, a little over 6 months later, he made the decision, and which he announced to the nation, a very shocked nation, on March 31st, 1968.
And we've talked a lot about the why he did it, but the timing. Can you kind of go into the timing of when he decided to do this and when to tell the American people?
He had thought about telling the American people during his State of the Union address in January of 1968. In fact, he had an addendum to the speech in his pocket that he was thinking of taking out and announcing that he would be stepping aside. He chose not to do that, and I think probably wisely, because he thought to himself, how can you be standing here in front of a joint session of Congress asking them to enact your agenda and at the same time tell them that you're a lame duck? So he decided to wait until later. In terms of the timing of March 31st, I think it came again after the Tet Offensive had occurred in Vietnam. That was a series of battles in Vietnam, all won roundly by U.S. troops, but they showed pretty clearly that no matter what we did militarily in Vietnam, the enemy was going to keep on coming. They were absolutely relentless. And Walter Cronkite famously made a trip to Vietnam, the most trusted man in America, and said that that the war was unwinnable. At best, it was a stalemate, and that the best thing we could do is pull out and strike after an honorable quest to win the war. But LBJ, seeing this, said, if I have lost Walter Cronkite, I have lost America. So I'm sure that was a factor too, not just seeing Walter Cronkite come out with a statement against the war, but so many in the media doing the same thing. And as I mentioned earlier, members of his own party.
And that actually leads right into my next question. Sort of like what happened this summer with the debate, and then all of a sudden sort of Democrats coming out against the idea of President Biden running. Was there a group of Democrats, were there people, as you mentioned, in his own party who were sort of being public about maybe LBJ stepping aside before he made the announcement?
Well, certainly Eugene McCarthy, who, as I just mentioned, was a threat as an anti-war candidate, but more notably Bobby Kennedy, someone you know well, came out and announced his own candidacy before the end of March 1968, seeing how successful Eugene McCarthy's campaign had been. And there was a lot of momentum around Bobby Kennedy's entry into the race. And Lady Bird Johnson said about Lyndon Johnson's relationship with the Kennedys were like a pebble in his shoe. And I think there was a particularly antagonistic relationship between Bobby Kennedy and Lyndon Johnson. And although Lyndon Johnson wouldn't have admitted to this, I think he was to some degree concerned about a challenge from Bobby Kennedy. It's worth noting, however, particularly given who is sponsoring this podcast, that Lyndon Johnson had, I think, a very harmonious relationship with Jack Kennedy, but the Kennedys were different people and had different relationships with him. And Bobby Kennedy's relationship with Lyndon Johnson's was absolutely toxic. So that might have been a factor in Lyndon Johnson's decision as well.
And something to think about in a few moments when we get to the current comparison. But before we get to that, I do want to finish up this moment in 1968. How did the public react to President Johnson's decision? Was it a surprise for a lot of people, or did they kind of see this coming?
A surprise, yes. Lyndon Johnson was this great paragon of power. He had gone into the House of Representatives in 1937. He had been there for 12 years, became senator in 1949, rose through the ranks quickly as minority whip, then minority leader, and then perhaps the most powerful majority leader in the history of the U.S. Senate. So he was associated with power. And then, of course, it was logical that Kennedy would throw him on the ticket in 1960 for regional balance, and because of LBJ's outsized presence in Washington and throughout the nation. But the fact that he would willingly step aside made a resounding statement There was a surge in approval around Lyndon Johnson, whose approval ratings had weakened in the latter part of his presidency. And as it happened, fatefully, Martin Luther King was assassinated just 4 days later. And then riots played out across the nation. And I think that affected Lyndon Johnson's approval. But the initial surge in his approval rating after his stepping aside suggests that the American people were very, very supportive of the decision.
And also similar to the situation we're in now, although the timing is different, in 1968 there were already a couple of compelling candidates for the Democratic Party, but then Hubert Humphrey, Johnson's vice president, comes onto the scene. Is there any parallels that you see between what happened today and then with the Hubert Humphrey's candidacy?
It bears mentioning, in some respects, yes. Because while there were primaries for the Democratic Party in 1968, Hubert Humphrey didn't participate in any of them. So in that respect, he was a logical heir apparent given the fact that he was vice president, given the fact that he was an established political presence outside the vice presidency in Washington, a well-known quantity, and the establishment candidate when Lyndon Johnson stepped aside. So there was a logic to Hubert Humphrey ultimately becoming the Democratic standard bearer after the incumbent president stepped aside. So in that respect, there is a parallel. It was logical that Kamala Harris would step aside in a very different and unusual circumstance. But she became the logical heir apparent to Joe Biden as vice president and as the person that he had tapped. Who else but Kamala Harris to pass the torch to in another quest to fend off a challenge by Donald Trump.
And then kind of thinking about the parallels again today, how would you compare the political atmosphere of 1968 to today when we have LBJ and Joe Biden deciding both to bow down for kind of, different reasons?
Well, the similarities are numerous. Number one, you have this incredibly tempestuous, volatile year, which, again, shakes us to our very core. So many things played out in 1968 that made Americans uneasy, that caused them to question what our future might look like. And I think the same thing is happening today. Different circumstances and different things playing out, but all leading to greater division around a great deal of tempest and volatility and anxiety and uncertainty as to what our future holds as a consequence of that. In that respect, they're very similar. But we have to remember that Lyndon Johnson opted not to seek the presidency at the very beginning of the presidential cycle. And on March 31st, 1968 is when he makes the decision. Joe Biden did so much later in the presidential cycle after a determinative primary process made him the candidate, the standard bearer for the Democratic Party. So in that respect, it's a very different circumstance. We'd never had a situation where somebody had earned the nomination very clearly, unambiguously, and then decided to step aside. And we have to remember, too, that election cycles are a lot longer now, and money plays a much bigger role. So there is a good reason in modern day politics that one announces his or her candidacy early so they can start the money train, because it's a very expensive endeavor to run for president. I think there was a great deal of anxiety to some degree about Biden stepping aside, only insofar as that was a big question mark. Would Kamala Harris be able to raise the kind of money that Joe Biden was able to raise as the crowned candidate for the Democratic National Party, given the fact that he had sewn up the delegates through the primary process? We just simply hadn't entered into a situation where a candidate earned the nomination and then said, you know what, I don't want it now. I'm going to give it back. So this was a totally unusual circumstance. And frankly, it's been shocking how quickly Kamala Harris has gained momentum, despite what seemed to me and to so many others as to be huge setbacks in launching a candidacy so late in the presidential cycle.
And now I want to get to a couple specifics about between 1968 and now. You mentioned the Tet Offensive and that failure, and then Walter Cronkite and LBJ's words, if I've lost Walter Cronkite, I've lost the nation. And we look at the debate night that President Biden faced, and almost immediately after that poor debate, you had everyone in the media sort of saying that Joe Biden should consider stepping down. How do you look at that with how the media sort of both took pointed attitudes towards both men after those major moments?
I think it was the media, but also the American public. I mean, I think to a large extent, the media was reflecting the sentiments of the American public. I have never seen a debate that was as definitive and consequential as the debate between former President Trump and President Biden. That performance by President Biden was uncharacteristically disastrous. We haven't seen anything even remotely like that from Biden since. So at some point in history, we might know better why Joe Biden performed so poorly. But it was a very fateful performance. I think that there was thunderous concern among Americans around what they saw in that debate as clear cognitive decline, or what appeared to be a cognitive decline. Debates tend to magnify what our preconceived notions about a candidate. There are some great examples of that in history. And it's the one time where Americans really tune in, because we can do this apples to apples comparison between the candidates. You don't get an opportunity like that in an election cycle, because presidents aren't standing on the same stage, but for those debates. So they become extraordinarily important, particularly to those unlike us who aren't political junkies, who aren't tuned into this stuff day after day after day. And Joe Biden reinforced the negative impressions that Americans had of him. So it was no surprise that those in his own party were calling for him to step aside, particularly since the concerns that Americans had related to his age, and Joe Biden is only going to get older. And if he were to earn a second term, would be 86 when he ultimately stepped down after a second term. So I think those were legitimate concerns. Again, I'm stunned by the rapidity with which Kamala Harris established herself among the Democratic base and among Democratic donors to wage what I think is a very impressive campaign.
We talked about the strained relationship between Robert F. Kennedy and President Johnson and what that created, and kind of comparing it to what we saw this summer, sort of with President Barack Obama and Speaker Pelosi sort of working behind the scenes, and again, kind of the reporting of the strained relationship through the process. What do you, as someone who's studied it with LBJ and RFK, how did you view any parallels between what we saw today with those leaders?
I think there's a gargantuan difference, and that is that Bobby Kennedy in 1968 had skin in the game, and he was vying for the presidency himself. He was somebody who wanted the nomination because he wanted to be president. So that's a little different. I think he and LBJ always had a contentious relationship, but part of that is because Bobby Kennedy viewed LBJ and vice versa as political rivals, right? Those guys were both looking at each other as potential threats. For Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi, it was a very different circumstance. They were looking at the future of the Democratic Party and, to a larger extent, the future of the nation. Joe Biden's candidacy was weakened by that debate. They saw that he was going to have greater obstacles in winning the presidency in a re-election battle against Donald Trump. And they were looking at what is at stake if Donald Trump were to win in November. So so that's the difference. Bobby Kennedy had skin in the game, and direct skin in the game, and Barack Obama and Nancy Pelosi were just concerned about their party and their country.
And here at the JFK Library Foundation, we think a lot about political courage, especially, when Johnson gave up his, a second full term. What type of courage or selflessness does it take for a president to decide not to run? And how rare is this type of act, do you think? Enormous
courage and self-awareness. Particularly with Lyndon Johnson and Joe Biden. I'm going to put Joe Biden in this category too. These are two, there are very few, if any, presidents who have more political experience and are more archetypal as it relates to what a politician is than LBJ and Joe Biden. As I mentioned, Joe Biden had a long career in the House and in the Senate. He was vice president. He was president. Very few presidents have had a bigger and better resume than LBJ. But Joe Biden might be considered one who does. He was in the Senate for 36 years, couldn't even take the oath in the Senate because he wasn't old enough. He was 29 years old when he got elected and 30 years old when he entered the Senate. He was in the vice presidency for 8 years, and he's been in the presidency for 4. He's a competitor, and he had already staved off an existential, what he considered, and I think what many of us consider, an existential threat to the country by preventing Donald Trump from earning another term in 2020. It's part of his legacy. It's the dominant part of his legacy, the preservation and strengthening of democracy. So when he saw a resurgent Donald Trump, of course he's thinking, I've got to do this again. This is part of my legacy. This is my mission, right? To preserve the democracy. It is the central cause of my presidency. So to have the self-awareness and the humility to say, you know what, I've had my turn. I'm not the best person to stay in this race in order to defeat Donald Trump a second, for another term in office. And I'm going to pass the torch. That takes enormous courage. And I think Joe Biden will be considered the most consequential one-term president in the history of our nation if Kamala Harris prevails in November, because Joe Biden's quest and Kamala Harris' quest to preserve our democracy will not have been fulfilled if Donald Trump gets another term in office. So Joe Biden's very consequential presidential legacy is very much in the balance. And if Kamala Harris wins, it will reflect not only on her, but on Joe Biden for stepping aside, knowing he wasn't the right person to carry the torch further.
And we just have one final question, and we'll do a little crystal ball glazing here. But in 1968, after Democrats lost that election and President Nixon was elected, do you think that history made some Democrats cautious about replacing Biden so late in the race this year? And then do you think this year the outcome could be different?
We have to remember that Hubert Humphrey lost to Richard Nixon in a squeaker. Humphrey was convinced, and I think there's pretty good evidence of this, that he was gaining steam at the very end of the election cycle. Nixon had a pretty good lead over him, according to polls, running up to the November election, and then they were running neck and neck. And Humphrey believed if he had another week, he would have won. And if you looked at the trends, that's probably the case. Timing is everything in politics. So I'm not sure it serves us to look back at 68 in terms of the election outcome as a precedent for what is going to play out this year. I think, as I mentioned to you, the reason that historians don't get crystal balls is because we're lousy at predicting the future. We're pretty good at looking at the past. I would never have been able to predict, again, how much steam Kamala Harris has gained in this extraordinary moment in American history. So it's hard for me to say what will happen from this moment forward. But if you look at the trends, if you look at the momentum that she and Tim Walz have gained at this moment, it would be hard to think that they won't continue to gain momentum throughout this election cycle. And they're almost waging a movement. And it is very hard in politics to stop a movement.
That's a great spot to end. Mark, thank you so much for your time. It was a great talk to you about 1968 and today.
Thanks so much, guys. It's been a pleasure being with you.
Thanks.
Thank you, Mark. One of the hallmarks of the United States' lasting democratic experiment is its history of maintaining a peaceful transition of power between presidents and their parties. The example was set by President George Washington nearly 250 years ago and has been carried out through 46 different presidencies.
Joining to talk to us about this long history is presidential historian and award-winning author Alexis Coe. She's also a senior fellow at the bipartisan think tank New America. Alexis, thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to be here.
So starting off with our first president, George Washington, he decided not to run for a third term, which set a precedent for future presidents. Can you talk about that decision and its impact on the presidency as a whole?
George Washington did not want to be president to begin with. He thought he would show up at the Constitutional Convention. That would be his last duty to this new nation, this infant nation, as he called it, and then he would return to Mount Vernon for his final retirement. But like many of his retirements before, it just didn't stick. All the founders and framers, including ones who he would later be on not the best terms with, came by, wrote him letters. James Madison refused to leave around Christmas, and they were convincing him to serve because they didn't figure out all the details about the presidency. They were looking at him presiding over the convention and thought, okay, he'll figure it out when he gets there. And so much was motivated by his own inclinations, which was not to be president. He called his voyage to the inauguration in New York the first sight of the president's home. He's like, I'm on my way to my execution, which aptly summarizes how he felt. And it was even worse than he had imagined. He had everything to lose. He was the most famous man in America. And suddenly, he is in this position where he can be criticized. And you have to remember that this is a man who held the title of master. That was the longest that he held, any title of his entire life. And then after that, it was general. And so he was used to people listening to what he said. He would invite them to participate in conversation, and then he would say thank you, and they would do as he said. That doesn't work when you're not in a military setting and you're not enslaving everyone you're giving these orders to. And so Washington felt very much like partisanship, which he had hoped to avoid by not declaring a political party, would get out of control if it was allowed. And of course, by saying there could be none, he couldn't codify that, but by saying there could be none and there shouldn't be any, that means that there was a ton of rampant partisanship. And he was at the center of so much criticism, most of it anonymous. People posted letters and essays in different publications, which were really like the first sort of Breitbart, Fox News, CNN, all these different perspectives, these really partisan newspapers that would be read aloud in pubs and circulate. And he was so sensitive. Jefferson said that he'd never seen anyone who was as sensitive as George Washington. And so the 2-term limit wasn't really based on anything but his absolute misery in office.
That's fascinating. Thank you. And in Washington's farewell address, he also warned of the potential dangers of political parties, which you just kind of referenced briefly, of one political faction dominating over another. How prescient do you think this warning was that he gave us as we're sitting here in 2024?
I spent about a decade preparing for my Washington book, and I read the farewell address many times, but I think I've read it more since my book came out. It reads, particularly for Washington, like a remarkably modern document. It's almost like he's anticipating everything that happened in the modern era, particularly since 2016. He talks about foreign influence, about how political parties will become obsessed with power. That's what they'll emphasize most of all. And so they'll no longer really serve the people who elected them, their constituents. They'll just do whatever it takes to maintain power. And that will lead to, his words, despotism. And so it feels really relevant to the moment. It also feels, and I felt this way in 2020, as we were watching people like Liz Cheney, who I think has received the Profiles in Courage Award, go against her party, go against what would be good as far as maintaining power. And I think she, in fact, was voted out shortly thereafter, and instead really put country before party. We saw that again with Joe Biden recently, after the first presidential debate. I think that it is a document that we should revisit more and more. It's a letter. It's not something that he delivered because he wanted it to belong to the people.
What does it say about the role of President Washington as a historic figure that this one action influenced the way presidential power would be given up all the way into the 20th century?
I think that's the really interesting point about this somewhat irresponsible plan that the framers had. They thought, okay, we'll just let Washington set a lot of precedents and everyone else will surely follow them out of nothing but reverence and respect. And that worked for the most part. For a lot of things, it worked until, of course, FDR. So we have 31 presidents after Washington who say, okay, 2 terms, that's enough for us. And then FDR serves the 3rd, and he runs again for a 4th. And so what we learned from that experience is the honor system doesn't work.
Yes, when this honor system didn't work, how quickly did the country realize it needed to fix the situation?
Well, remember that FDR was president during a complicated time. He was trying to get the country out of the Great Depression. There was also World War II. There was a feeling throughout the country that you should support a wartime president, but you should also not let a wartime president become the forever president. By the time FDR was inaugurated for his 4th term, people were pretty concerned. And within, I think, 6 years, Congress passed the amendment codifying 2-term limits.
So you did mention FDR not following the 2-term limit. What was the public's reaction to that? That was, obviously very unprecedented. And he ran and won successfully 4 times. What did the public think?
Democrats, supporters were trusting of him. He was a wartime president. He had made massive improvements after the Great Depression. Life was getting easier. He had policies that were popular, but also unpopular. No one is ever in total agreement in a healthy democracy. There's always a fair amount of debate. As the 3rd term and then the 4th term came to rise, people were getting increasingly concerned about what that might look like. And it's interesting to watch it unfold in a biography as I'm reading along with it, because it is basically Washington's nightmare. He had been concerned that if he stayed in office, even though he was 64 when he left office, that he might die in office. He was in perfectly good health. He loved to complain about his health when he wanted to quit a job. He did the same thing after the American Revolution. He was like, I can't see, I'm so old. He was fine. And then after he left office, actually, after he left the presidency, of course, John Adams faced possible war with France and appointed Washington to be head of the army. So clearly, even though he had retired and he claimed to be too old to serve, he was doing okay. But Washington was really concerned that if a president died in office, it would look an awful lot like a monarchy. And then people would continue to serve until someone died. And then that's like a slippery slope to inherited titles.
And then why did Congress and then the country decide to pass the 22nd Amendment after, as Washington feared FDR died in office? Had there been other presidents ahead of FDR who had tried for a 3rd term and just weren't successful?
Presidents had definitely been interested in serving more than 2 terms, but no one was successful at the level that FDR was and secured it. What was the impetus for Congress passing an amendment, and we've had so few amendments, the framers had anticipated far more within, even the first 100 years. It was simply the understanding that you could not trust a president to leave after 2 terms, that there could be some sort of justification, a war, a depression, perhaps a pandemic. And so what you see is Congress moving towards laws in general. We have this presidency that is so amorphous, it's so unshapen, that as time goes on, they codify more and more things. The Presidential Records Act, for instance, is a fairly recent phenomenon, but that's another example. And so I think it's just a matter of not trusting the president with that much power and that much sort of access to maintaining that power. There are limits on the presidency, there are controls in place, but there's nothing like a law that explicitly says you can't do that.
Returning to the present, how does the example of President Biden's decision to step down compare with the reasons why Washington chose to leave office after 2 terms?
Washington was begging to leave office. He was begging to give up his commission after the war was over. Biden hesitated, and I think would have continued to hesitate. I think that word choice is fairly generous, had an increasing number of Democrats and pundits not called for him to step aside and make way for Kamala Harris. And I know that we all found ourselves in interesting and sort of uncomfortable positions that we had never been in. I, for example, had never anticipated writing an op-ed in Rolling Stone calling for Biden to step down. And I framed it very specifically about his legacy. I didn't think that he would read this essay, but if he did, I wanted to focus less on being old and, these sort of touches of ageism and concerns about his ability to perform a task, and focus on his long record of service as well as his accomplishments in office. I was concerned that if he continued to sort of stubbornly hold on to the seat of power and to commit to this second term to running, that it would eclipse his entire legacy. So instead of rivaling FDR as the most progressive president, the entire, you'd be moving towards this destination of refusing to give up power. And now the good part is, I will say, I think he has so minimized that part of his legacy by handing the baton to Kamala Harris, and now his tenure is associated with, one Black president, the first Black president, possibly the second Black president, the first woman vice president. So that chapter will be just a chapter, and it will end really triumphantly.
Prior to 2020, we've seen the peaceful transition of power take place from president to president. In fact, most presidents and parties highlight the example that America is a place where opposition parties peacefully hand over power to each other. Have there been any other times where the transition from one president to another was more contentious, or is 2020 an anomaly in American history?
2020 is an anomaly as far as violence. We had a relatively peaceful revolution. I know that's hard to conceive of, considering how bloody it was, and some of the really harrowing accounts of violence by Hessians and rapes and, the loss of private property. But we inspired an age of revolutions that were far bloodier: the French Revolution, the Haitian Revolution. What we have before the 2020 election, before the January 6th insurrection, is basically sour grapes. So you have John Adams refusing to stick around for Thomas Jefferson's inauguration. You have sort of that kind of contentious relationship, but people could get in a buggy and ride together to the Capitol. There was, we have an abundance of photographs of older presidents, as soon as photographs were in existence, begrudgingly sharing a seat in a car in whatever kind of transportation they took. So there was this emphasis on civility and on being cordial because it was something that Americans were proud of.
And I think because of that tradition of having at least cordiality public facing, do you think that sometimes the U.S. citizens kind of take that for granted? It's happened, for a couple centuries now, we've had peaceful transfers of power. And is that something that we just kind of take for granted?
Absolutely. Watching the insurrection was shocking. And recalling the amount of times that I had talked about the peaceful transition of power and realizing it had been very few, it was something we all took for granted. It seemed performative. It seemed like kind of filler, the sort of thing that people talk about when you need to fill the moments before inauguration. You're describing people's outfits, traditions, things that most Americans kind of tune out as background noise. So I think it was taken for granted. And I think that there were a lot of warnings as well. And as much as people kept saying, well, believe this person if they say this, we hadn't experienced anything like that. We have had a relatively peaceful nation in comparison to other countries. And now we are aware. So it'll be interesting to see what sort of safeguards are in place as we move forward.
And just final question for our interview. What else can we learn from the earliest presidents about examples of handing off power and placing the nation above self-interest?
I always say that there are 18th and 19th century presidents who we revere who would not be elected by today's standards. We have come to regard the election as a year-long season of this reality show, and we have expectations that it'll be entertaining. And I think that is distracting, and it doesn't emphasize what should be important to the electorate, which is policy, which is trying to understand the quality of a person, to look at the kind of attributes and principles that we need in a leader. And I think that is something that we would do well to pay more attention to now that we've had so many warnings.
Alexis, thank you so much for your time. It was great to talk to you again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode in our special season looking at the historic nature of the 2024 election. We'll have a new episode each Thursday until Election Day. If you're interested in learning more about some of the topics we discussed today, you can visit our podcast page for this episode at jfklibrary.org/jfk35.
If you have questions or story ideas, email us at jfk35pod@jfklfoundation.org or find us across social media at jfklibraryfdn using the hashtag JFK35. If you liked what you heard today, please consider subscribing or leaving us a review wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for listening. Have a great week.